All right, I know exactly where you are right now. You just ordered your finasteride prescription. After all, you've read all about it on the internet. It seems like such an excellent option for hair loss. But now you're starting to have some second thoughts. Are there side effects? Is finasteride safe? What is post-finasteride syndrome? Is it real? So you start to Google, and before you know it, it's 1 a.m. in the morning, and you've opened an entire can of worms. Now you're at a crossroads. One side of the internet says that finasteride is a miracle drug and it totally reversed their hair loss and now their life is great. The other side says that their life is ruined from starting this medication. Both sides can't be the whole story. My name is Kevin. I'm a licensed pharmacist from Crown Craft, and in this video I'm going to tell you what post-finasteride syndrome actually is, where the term came from, and how seriously to take it, without any hype, but also without any dismissal of either side of the story. Just my honest take about where the evidence comes from and grounded in reality. One important perspective that I want you to keep in mind throughout this entire series is that for the overwhelming majority of men who take finasteride or dutasteride, side effects don't occur. And they don't get post-finasteride syndrome. They actually just tolerate the medication just fine. I want you to remember that when you're watching this video and every other video in this series. And I'm not just saying that to say it. The data doesn't support this. That's what we have to look to when we examine these sort of claims. Does the evidence support it? That's not to say that for the people who are experiencing side effects, that this is a fake. It's a very real phenomenon, and it can be very devastating if it's happening to you, and you deserve to have your experience taken seriously. However, something can be both extremely rare and also potentially devastating if it does affect you. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And just right up front, I'll summarize the entire premise of this video series. Post-finasteride syndrome appears to be a genuinely real disorder, but it is a very rare syndrome that appears to affect a very small and potentially predisposed subset of individuals. There are certain people who this might have a much greater likelihood of happening to. It's not all in your head. If you've experienced this problem, if you're suffering from side effects, it is very real to you, but it's also not something that is likely to occur as a person who just starts taking this medication. A good analogy I like to think about or use is driving a car, something most of us do every single day. Car accidents are absolutely real and they can be totally devastating. You could die or be permanently disabled from a car accident, right? This literally happens to people every single day. Unfortunately, there's probably someone getting into a car accident right now as I'm speaking. However, I don't drive a car in fear of that happening, just shaking in my seat. Every single time I start the engine, I'm not panicking or having anxiety. That also doesn't mean that I take no precautions and I just drive a car without a care in the world. I understand the risks and how to make sense of it and how to navigate them. And maybe there are certain things I can do to lower that risk, like wearing a seatbelt. You should apply this same concept if and when you decide to start taking finasteride or dutasteride. The whole point of this video series is so that you can make a decision with clarity, not anxiety. You should understand the data, you understand how this thing works, and then you can make an informed decision. Before I speak further about post-finasteride syndrome, finasteride side effects, you have to understand why it's so hard to find an honest take on this and probably why you're confused. And it comes from that there's two sort of contradictory groups of people, two contrarian takes, right? So group one is your gloom and doom group, and they treat every side effect as proof that this is over, your life is over, this is the worst mistake you'll ever make, it's not worth any kind of benefits from the medication. And then there's the whole other side, which is, often like clinics, people selling the medication, or people who have been on the med for a long time, they don't have any issues. So they're gonna kind of like hand wave the whole thing and say like, that's not really a thing, don't worry about it. And when you kind of look at it further, it's understandable why they would say that. For the side effect group, this is a deeply emotional and very real reality that they're living. It's not something that they could hand wave away. In fact, they wish they could, they would do it, right? If you're suffering, you would just hope that you could just snap your fingers and be like, okay, it was all in my head. They can't do that. It's a real thing for them. And they're trying to share their genuine experience from a place of trying to help other people. It's coming from good intentions. And well, for the other camp of sellers or people trying to pitch a product, fear is simply bad for business. You can look at my other video, I'll link it down below, to Lock Lab, which was a direct-to-consumer finasteride business, telehealth business, similar to Hims. And they don't mention side effects very prominently at all. You had to go really digging deep into the webpage to even find it, any mention of side effects, right? So they're kind of like minimizing that either. So there's really a cost to only living in one group's reality. So if you just take the fear-mongering side, this could paralyze you and it could prevent you from going on this medication when you could have actually taken the medication and have been totally fine. That's what the data suggests, is that the majority of men don't have problems. They don't experience side effects. Whereas complete dismissal will abandon someone who is genuinely suffering a very real reality. I don't want to do either. I'm going to take the least sexy route, the nuanced take. It's not going to clip nicely. It's not neat, simple, and clean, but it is as objective and as honest as I can be. When both sides are yelling, the truth isn't always in the middle, but it's almost never entirely one angle or the other. So you should be very wary of any so-called expert who takes a super complex topic and distills it down into a simple one-note hot take. It's usually BS. They've often glossed over a lot of nuance. Topics like this are much more complex than can be easily conveyed in a 30-second video. So you might be asking already, like, Kevin, are you trying to scare me off finasteride? The simple answer is no. I'm trying to inform you. Like I said, millions of people take this drug without issue, but it's not without costs for all people. So I think we should begin with a definition of what post-finasteride syndrome actually is. Simply put, it's essentially a cluster of symptoms, certain side effects, that show up during or after taking finasteride. And in this small group of patients, they don't go away when the drug is stopped. That's the weird part. Sometimes in patient experiences, people report that these symptoms first appeared or even got worse after the medication was discontinued, which is strange and unexpected. It's counter to what you may believe, right? If you take a medication, you have side effects, and you stop the medication, typically those side effects go away. That happens for some people, but for a small group of people, the opposite is true. These symptoms or side effects that these patients experience are composed of 4 domains. So the first one would be sexual. That's one of the most common. So these sort of side effects or symptoms would be like a loss of libido, erectile dysfunction. They have reduced sensation or sense of numbness in their genitals, and a blunted orgasm. And they kind of like feel disconnected from that part of themselves, their own sexuality. There's also neuropsychiatric or the mental and emotional side effects. So this can show up as depression, anxiety, feeling emotionally blunted, something called anhedonia, which is the loss of ability to feel pleasure. Life is just kind of numb. Another group of side effects would be the cognitive ones. So brain fog. People have memory and concentration issues. And there's also physical changes as well. So people feel fatigue, They notice changes in body composition for the worse, right? They're like gaining fat. They have like skin changes. People have like joint and muscle complaints, things like this. You should know that there's no officially adopted definitive diagnostic criteria for post-finasteride syndrome. The most cited one actually comes from a patient foundation, not a medical board, but it's still quite good. I'll link to that right here. You can take a look at it. But essentially, they say that these sort of symptoms that I just mentioned, they should persist for at least 3 months after stopping the medication, and they needed to rule out other causes of these symptoms in these patients. It's almost a diagnosis of exclusion first, right? So you have to exclude everything else before it can be counted as post-finasteride syndrome. So the exact definition is still being pinned down because it's such a new and developing disorder that people are still learning more and more about. In fact, it's only within the last 10 years or so that more research has come out. So the criteria is not standardized, is the take-home message.
Enjoying the video so far? Well, please hit subscribe. It's the most evidence-based way to keep the hair on my head from falling out. Thank you.
If you're not experiencing any side effects from finasteride and your life is going great and you have great hair, sometimes it's very easy to dismiss or just be a bit detached from the experiences of people who are suffering. And I think it's important to keep that in mind and maybe connect a little bit to that because these are very real human experiences. I believe a very good source for that is from the FDA patient listening session, which happened in 2023. It was an open forum where people who were suffering or are suffering from post-finasteride syndrome were invited to share their personal experiences. Some of these are really quite heavy. I'm not going to go over them verbatim, but one guy told the FDA panel that he felt unable to feel emotion at the funeral of a loved one. That's quite extreme. He called it essentially his own mental death. Another very common sentiment amongst these patients was that they felt that they were not the same person that they once were before starting the medication. In fact, tragically, there was one account from a parent who talked about her son going through the struggles with post-finasteride syndrome, and then he eventually actually took his own life as a result of being unable to navigate his illness. So these are very real patient experiences, and it is not something you should take lightly, and their voices deserve to be listened to with respect. Here's something that surprised me when I first looked into post-finasteride syndrome. This name didn't come from a research group or a big lab. It actually came from patients' direct experiences, and they were able to identify a side effect signal many years before the science caught up. This is actually really fascinating, and I think it's worth looking into the timeline a little bit. So way back in 2003, it was actually on a Yahoo group for men who were just talking about symptoms that didn't go away after they stopped finasteride. That's the very first little traces of post-finasteride syndrome becoming documented on the internet. And some years go by, and then in 2006, that community of men, they start propitiahelp.com, which is still the largest patient forum today, specifically for people suffering from post-finasteride syndrome. And then many years later, in 2011, this is the first formal research paper on persistent sexual side effects from people who have been taking finasteride. So you can see here that patients have been talking about it for about 8 years before the literature caught up. Now onward to 2012, this is where the term gets like an institutional home when the Post-Finasteride Syndrome Foundation is founded. So the order of these events is actually pretty important. So one group may say that, oh, a community can sort of like amplify these sort of symptoms and kind of like shape the language around it. There's some validity to that. I'll talk about that in a later episode. But this same order also means that this term wasn't invented by marketing or by a lawsuit. It started with men describing something that they didn't have words for. A lot of real conditions were actually named by people living them before medicine had a formal name for it. Patients noticing it first is not definitive proof, but it's not something you can ignore either. For example, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, was first described most commonly in World War I veterans, but a lot of people dismissed their experiences, said that you're just weak, or it's all in your head. And then only like 60 years later did we have enough research to quantify as like a real phenomenon with treatments and a lot of science behind it, right? So oftentimes there's a huge lag between people noticing something is wrong and the science establishing that as definitive and grounded, right? So you have to keep that in mind. So moving forward a bit in the timeline, the signal becomes a little bit more real and a little bit more clear. In 2011, the FDA adds the word depression to the finasteride package insert. So the package insert is like that long list of like technical information and a little pamphlet that's included with most medications. You would typically throw that out, right? No one really reads that, but they do add that term to that label. It was actually Merck that submitted this request for inclusion, so good job on them. Probably kind of cover their ass. This was based on pharmacovigilance data that was collected worldwide that showed an increase in depression amongst some patients who took this medication. As a side note, pharmacovigilance is simply the practice of continuing to collect data on side effects and adverse effects on medications that have already made it to market, so that they can identify new trends and worrisome signals that they would then use to decide whether or not to continue to even make this medication, should they add additional warnings, things like that. Moving on to 2012, the FDA also expands their sexual side effect language on both forms of finasteride, the 1 milligram Propecia and the 5 milligram Proscar, which is for enlarged prostate. They also explicitly noted that some of these problems were reported to continue after men stopped taking the medication, but they did not say that they had established a true cause and effect. So most of these label modifications would have been for things like reduced libido, erectile dysfunction, problems with ejaculation, things like that we've already mentioned prior. They also included reports of male infertility and poor semen quality to both drug labels, but these are noted to improve or normalize after stopping the medication. And then fast forwarding a little bit further into 2022, the FDA adds suicidality, which is suicidal ideation and behavior, to the US label for the first time. However, this is not a black box warning, which is like the highest risk and most dangerous sort of warning that you can attach to a medication. Now, going across the pond a little bit to Europe in 2025, the EMA, the European Medicine Agency, their safety committee concluded that suicidal thoughts are a recognized risk of finasteride and dutasteride and mandates changes to the medication. So they have to include now a patient safety card in every box of medication sold. The product info has to be modified and revised, and they have mental health screening guidance is sort of included. And they flagged that most cases they saw were in younger men who were on the 1 milligram like hair loss dose. And then also in the US in 2025, the FDA issues a safety alert on compounded topical finasteride after there are reports of like mood and sexual symptoms from people who started taking the medication. Topical is not as strong of a signal as oral finasteride, but it's not like a perfectly safe sort of way to skirt the side effects either. The NIH also lists post-finasteride syndrome in its rare disease database in 2015. And then you also have the 2023 listening session that I mentioned earlier. So what does this all mean? Well, a warning label is a precaution about a signal. It's not a proof of mechanism. The FDA itself said that it had not established definitive cause and effect, But the fact that regulators from the US and from Europe are taking action tells you that the concern is credible and something you should flag. But it doesn't mean that the entire chain of events has been established that if you take this pill, this is what's going to happen, and this syndrome has been nailed down. That is not the case. You have to remember that medicine and medicine regulators are inherently a very conservative and defensive group of people. So they are going to try to disseminate information as much as possible and let people be informed about it. They're not going to wait until things are totally clear and completely finalized before they make a decision to release information like this. A great analogy to take is like these sort of warning labels and new labeling. They're like a smoke detector that is beeping. It means that, hey, there could be something wrong, right? Your house could be on fire. It doesn't mean your house is on fire, but there's probably smoke, and you should probably take a look around your surroundings to see what's going on. The fact that they are spreading these sort of warnings and disseminating this information out into the world is a good thing. It means that the system is taking these rare cases seriously so that you can make informed decisions, which is the entire point of this series. So post-finasteride syndrome appears to be a genuine phenomenon that impacts a small group of men, but there's a wide gap of debate as to what actually causes it. And there's two camps, and it's heavily contested. So one group says that it can't only be biology, there must be a psychological component. Some would say that this is mostly psychological. Some evidence that does support their claims, like for example, low libido and low mood are not uncommon in men. A lot of men have that just at baseline. Reporting for this syndrome also increased after this condition got famous online. That's a real paradox here. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Sometimes it's known as the Weber effect, but not going to get into that now. Other researchers have argued that expectation plays a big role in PFS. There's also a term called the nocebo effect. So that's when expectation drives real symptoms. It's not fake or in your head, but it is a real phenomenon that could be playing into post-finasteride syndrome. I will expand upon this much greater on a later episode. There's also this extreme far skeptic piece where some people say that this is a mass hysteria sort of situation. I don't think that that's actually the case here. I don't believe that the FDA would mention all these labeling changes and talk about all these very defined symptoms if this was merely a psychogenic cause. However, there is also evidence for the other side, which says that this is a biological phenomenon. And there are measurable differences in patients with PFS versus a control group. There's changes in neurosteroid levels in cerebrospinal fluid. There's changes in nerve conduction in people's genitals. There are changes in androgen receptors, and there's also changes in gene expression in people who are affected. And there's also various animal studies that show lasting changes after finasteride, right? So those animal studies are hard to ignore. A rat cannot read a forum post and get freaked out and then start experiencing post-finasteride syndrome. That does not happen. So, what is the truth here? I don't know, but I wanted to give a little bit of weight to both angles. I think there's probably a bit of both happening at the same time. So my most honest read of the evidence, as I see it right now, is that PFS is a genuine but uncommon pharmacological syndrome in a predisposed subset of individuals whose apparent frequency of these reports, they may be amplified by awareness in some settings. So you might be thinking, isn't this kind of a slam dunk for happening in men who are already anxious, right? They have a pre-existing condition which is then exacerbated by going on finasteride and hearing all about this. That's a fair question, but the answer is don't assume that. There's actually a survey of patients who have had post-finasteride syndrome, and they found a lower baseline of mental health conditions in people who are affected by post-finasteride syndrome than in the general population. And a lot of these symptoms go far beyond mood, like the physical ones. So don't just assume things, but there's probably a great deal of overlap here that's worth considering. Awareness can certainly inflate how often something gets reported. I'm not trying to, dodge that fact. But this situation can also be devastatingly real for the people who are actually going through it. Those two things aren't opposites, and treating them as opposites is exactly how this conversation keeps going into the wrong direction. So if this is real for some men, how could a pill that only blocks a hair hormone reach a guy's mood, his memory, and his ability to feel pleasure at all? This is the key question, right? Finasteride was brought along for a very precise task, to turn down DHT at the hair follicle. But something people may not have told you is that that same switch might be connected to very different departments within your body. It affects much more than just hair. And also the fact that when you take the medication, you kind of like turn that switch down. Sometimes stopping the medication doesn't flip that switch back. So if you're scared to start finasteride, now you know you're not likely to get this from starting the medication. It's very uncommon. But now you can decide, hopefully after watching all of my videos, what to do with clarity and from a well-informed position, instead of being fearmonger to and from a place of anxiety. And if you're living with this right now, you know that this is not all in your head. This is very real, and hopefully you get some answers about what's actually happening to you and what you could do about it. You might be able to find that out if you join me for the next 5 episodes in this series. Anyways, thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you found this video helpful. Follow along. I'll be diving a little bit deeper into this topic. Probably episode 2 will be dropping very soon. And if you're currently taking finasteride, are you dealing with any side effects? Is there anything you're unsure about? Just drop your questions in the comments below. All right, this is Kevin from Crowncraft, and I'm out. See ya.